Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and joining promptly. I'm Noah Flaherty, CTO and co-founder here at Vellum. We're going to get things started at the 3-minute mark here and just give folks a couple more minutes to trickle in. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera and mic, but we will start officially at the 3-minute mark. See you soon. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and welcome. Welcome to session 3 of our Championing Gen AI webinar series, Bring Your AI Systems to Life Faster. My name is Noah Flaherty, CTO and co-founder here at Vellum. And in today's session, we'll be talking about how to successfully launch your AI products to production and iterate based on real-world feedback. I'm super excited to be joined here today by Jordan Nimro, CTO and co-founder of Woflow. And together we'll be diving into best practices for transitioning your AI systems from prototype to production, monitoring their performance, and making improvements over time. I see a couple of familiar faces and names in the chat here, so thanks so much for those joining from prior sessions. Just a reminder, previously we talked about how to brainstorm and pitch internally new AI features and prototype them. In the second session, we talked about test-driven development in the world of AI and how to evaluate your AI-powered features. And then finally, again, in this one, we're talking about how to take those AI products to production and iterate on them with confidence once they are there. So that is the game plan. Just a few housekeeping items real quick before we get started. We love an engaging audience. Please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already, and let us know what AI projects and features you're working on and any challenges you're facing. This webinar, we hope is interactive. We'll be answering questions. We'll be kind of addressing those challenges that people bring up. So please let us know in the chat what you're thinking about. As far as questions go, we'll be sprinkling them in throughout the hour today, but we'll also save some time towards the end for any that we weren't able to get to throughout the session. So there's that questions section in the bottom right of the webinar software. There's also the chat. Either one is good. Just let us know any questions or topics that you'd like us to cover. Friendly reminder that this webinar is being recorded, so no worries if you miss anything and want to review it later. We'll be sharing out a link to this recording afterwards. And then finally, we'll also include in an email not only this recording, but also a copy of today's slides. And towards the end of these slides, we have a bunch of links and resources that you can dig into if you want to learn more. All right. Well, without further ado, let's dive in just a little bit about Vellum. We are a AI product development platform, and our goal is to help transform early stage AI ideas into production grade features. And we provide companies like Woflow, the tools needed for experimenting, testing, launching, and monitoring AI powered features. Enough about us. I would love to have Jordan introduce himself, Woflow, and what you guys use AI for. Welcome, Jordan.
Awesome. Thank you, Noah. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. I'm Jordan Emro. I'm the CTO and co-founder at Woflow. Primarily what Woflow does is data management for merchants, for platforms like DoorDash and Uber, and point of sale companies like Toast and Lightspeed and Square. Essentially, if you're a merchant onboarding onto one of those platforms to sell your goods, in the US, there's a high probability that we're the ones that have processed that onboarding, and also abroad, a very good possibility. We started out way before AI was AI, and so we have a lot of human in the loop activity. And over the last 2 years, as AI has become AI, we've implemented a huge amount of it. We've gone really all in on it. And a lot of what we've done this past year is transition a lot of that stuff over to Vellum. And so I think I'm a pretty good candidate here to kind of give some production advice on how we did it and how it's going and how we're evaluating it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. So we'll talk about all these good things here. Let me go ahead and stop my screen share. So I guess, Jordan, how do we, let's take one of your AI examples and kind of go into more detail maybe, or to the level of detail you feel comfortable sharing, and talk about its life cycle. How did it start? How did you prototype it? And then what was the path to production?
Yeah, there's a million different applications I could use as an example, but I'll use one because it's very tangible. It's easy to visualize, and that is essentially dissecting an image of a menu. So if you're a restaurant and you're onboarding onto a platform, how do we take that PDF of that menu and actually turn it into data that can then be used by users to order the food? Seems simple at a really high level. It kind of is simple, but then when you get into the weeds, it's insanely complicated. So let's take a step back to a year ago and how we thought about doing this. We had humans doing a lot of bounding box concepts. So we have our own workflow of how we can automate the process. But the workflow itself is all in code. There's no diagrams like we have today. And the actual steps we go through don't work that well. And then, again, this is from a year ago, and that's because AI was not where it is today. Bringing it to today, and something that an application that would make sense is being able to take that PDF of a menu and use a workflow in Vellum to dissect individual components of the PDF and then run asynchronously different threads of logic to be able to understand different parts of that menu, and then in the end compile it all together. So the workflow itself is quite big and has a lot of, I'm assuming many people here understand map nodes and how all of that works in Vellum.
Yeah, and in case people don't, we're using the word workflow, which is pretty Vellum specific in this case. But another way to think about it might be pipeline or graph. You think about even traditional programming, you've got a stack trace, right? Which is kind of the steps in the the sequence of events or steps that your program is taking. And Jordan, I think what you're describing is these concrete individual steps that operate as a pipeline for processing this PDF. And each step, or what we would call node in the graph, is used to perform a different operation. And then at the end of all this big sequence of operations, or at the end of this pipeline or this workflow, you end up with the structured data that you're looking to extract from this PDF. Is that fair to say?
Perfect. I should have just used you as my script there. That was exactly what I was trying to say. I think that's a great way to put it. It's exactly correct. If you think about what we were doing prior to building pipelines in the form of a graph, we were making a graph anyway. So we were physically on a whiteboard or in some sort of like graphic tool, creating our own workflow in a diagram about, okay, so it gets to here, we're going to run an LLM to decide if it is an item or a description or whatever. At that point, it's going to branch off, run some logic, branch off again. So we actually physically made these diagrams and then turned it into code, right? Like there wasn't the idea of using the diagrams as the actual code itself. Fast forward to today, that's exactly what we're doing. So we're removing that middle step of turning that graph, that diagram into code. That diagram is the code. And so it's a whole different paradigm of how you think about really engineering. And what sits in the middle of all of these nodes is there are LLMs in a lot of the nodes. A lot of the nodes are not LLMs, right?
Yeah.
So I think like using LLMs as an example to like as a case statement, switch which path you go down. Before you weren't able to actually make that decision without a human. Now you can. And so this idea of having this workflow as logic is brilliant and has really simplified a lot of what we do at Wellflow.
There's a lot of exciting stuff to dig into there. I think like
yeah,
you should change how you do engineering. We will touch on that, but I guess I always like to draw analogies between how AI development is increasingly looking like certain aspects of software development. So if I were to equate the two here, in software development, like we often draw system diagrams, right? Or we're mapping the interactions between different pieces of cloud infrastructure or maybe microservices. And it sounds like what you're describing is like kind of similar, where it's like these LLMs are almost acting as like microservices or like steps in the sequence. And this graph is representing the system diagram, but it's both like the documentation of the behavior as well as the actual execution of that behavior.
100%. I mean, that's a good analogy because before OpenAI came out with their API, the idea of using an AI system was very complicated. Now it's as simple as it is an API request, right? It's no different than hitting the Twilio API to send a text message, right? It's a black box. There's a lot going on in there. And so to me, it is software engineering. I think AI engineering or whatever you want to call it, it is all just understanding how does this black box fit into the rest of your workflow, or I keep saying workflow, but you know what I mean, in the rest of your pipeline or in the rest of the flow to accomplish whatever you want.
Yep. Yeah. And, if I think about like, whenever you're integrating with third-party APIs, whether they're API call to OpenAI or an API call to Stripe or whatever it might be, you have to do things like error handling. You have to think about what happens if this API call what happens if that third-party service is down or changes the schema in its response, or like, and it's like not all that dissimilar from like integrating with many microservices where you're having to like, what happens if the microservice doesn't work? So I think if I equate it to like data engineering and data pipelining, there's kind of analogies there where it's like retry or like reprocess or save incremental results such that you can resume from that point in time. It's just like fascinating to see some of those analogies there.
No, totally. And kind of speaking to that point, the black box, like the AI black box, is obviously a lot more complicated than the like Twilio black box, right? Like you're going to say send a text message to this number, you're going to get a response. It either worked or it didn't work.
Yep.
And you move on. With LLMs, that's not the case. It can hallucinate. It can do like whatever, right? It can go insane, and you have no idea why. And so you do have to handle it differently. And so what I love about using the Vellum workflows and having what they're called prompt nodes, having the actual like LLM sitting in one of the nodes, it's actually recording everything that's going in and everything that's going out and everything in between. And so we're able to identify when things are going wrong and why they're going wrong. And I think
Mm,
for like a Twilio API, it's dead simple to do that. You're probably going to get an error log in your own system and say like it just didn't work.
yeah.
Whereas with LLMs, if it's trying to tag something, let's say another one of our workflows is we do a lot of like auto tagging of different elements of catalogs. Um, it can absolutely hallucinate, or even not hallucinate. A lot of the times it's just maybe we have a different interpretation of what the request is for the prompt, right? And so
Mhm.
maybe a customer would call in and be like, why would the, you know, pimento cheeseburger be spicy? Is a stupid example. And we'd be like, honestly, I don't know, but we can actually find where that tagging took place because we are doing all of these recordings in Vellum. We identify it immediately. We can use that specific example as a test case or as like a sandbox case and be able to replay it. And this is like the most important part, is make sure you can replicate it. Like I think a lot of times maybe you're looking down going down a rabbit hole and you're trying to look for the wrong thing, but make sure you can replicate it. You can see, okay, yes, it's tagging the pimento burger spicy. A little tip I use sometimes is I'll alter the prompt just for the sandbox environment. Ask it like specifically, why did you make this spicy?
Mm,
And then see what it responds with. And it'll usually give you some information that'll help you apply to the prompt to fix it.
that's a good tip.
It also might just hallucinate and like it just happens. Like that's the thing with AI is like there is no perfect way to do it, but there's a lot of guardrails that are at your fingertips that you can use, a lot of tools.
Yeah.
But yeah, that'd be an example.
Yeah, that's cool. I would love to like dig in a little deeper into like what are the things that you've needed to feel confident putting these like non-deterministic AI systems into production. From what I just heard, one of those things might be like good monitoring, right? Like being able to monitor and visualize and see the inputs and outputs of each of these steps in your pipeline on every invocation of it, right? So,
Yeah.
um, I think another thing you mentioned was being able to like take like notice when it goes wrong and then you use that as a test case and like iterate on the system until it performs better on that test case that I assume came from that monitoring layer. Are there other like do you want to expand on either of those two? Or are there
Yeah,
other
I think
things that you would need to before you felt
well
confident putting it in the prod?
well first off, if you're not using structured outputs, then you're not using the tools that you should. I mean, that's been a game changer. That was a huge pain point for us,
Yeah,
just in
it's an
general.
awesome feature.
It's really, really cool. Obviously, when JSON mode came out, that was like game changer number one, but didn't solve all the problems. But we were confident that it was giving us real JSON. We had like weeks of work trying to tether together like mismatched JSON. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then like, a couple of weeks later, OpenAI comes out with a thing that just makes that obsolete, which is great. But then
I guess to
structured
pause you
JSON,
there, just
yeah,
so just in case other people aren't familiar, what Jordan I think you're referencing is OpenAI's structured outputs feature, where you can provide an OpenAPI spec that says, "Hey, I want you to return a JSON response, and it must conform to the schema that I specify." And it's like game changer for use cases where you want to perform structured data extraction. Of course, it's not as relevant if you're doing like creative, story generation or things where you're not generating JSON. But if you are and you have a desired schema, really awesome.
yes. I guess I'll back up briefly and say a lot of what's in our production code is not like create a story and it's not a chat bot. So a lot of what we've put to production is more workflow automation in general. However, one of our products that we are and have been working on is a chatbot. So I do understand how a lot of the chatbot process works as well. And I will say there's a huge amount of nodes that actually should use structured output, even in chatbots, right? There's still very, very important to figuring out like the case statements and when you're actually branching off into doing different things. So I think in general it's super important. But if you are just doing like straight up write me a story, structured outputs, yeah, are probably not in your wheelhouse right now, or not in your purview. So, sorry, yeah, I should try to elaborate on some of these things. I forget it's not just you and I talking, Noah.
Absolutely, yeah, totally. I guess so you've got structured outputs give you confidence that it's going to generate the JSON you expect. Monitoring lets you know when things go wrong. My understanding, Jordan, is that you guys have a pretty interesting split deployment process where you deploy changes to your AI systems separately from the rest of your web application. Can you tell me more about how this, what that difference is and why
Yeah,
you've chosen to go down that path?
yeah. I mean, honestly, it's a byproduct of using Vellum. It wasn't even something that we thought about going into the project, but we have a relatively diligent deploy cycle. And when we want to do an off cycle deploy, it tends to be troublesome. So if you work on a large enterprise platform, you probably know what I'm talking about. One thing that is nice to be able to iterate on relatively quickly is all of these AI prompts. So a prompt can be as little as adding one sentence to a prompt that literally fixes a problem. That's one thing, or it could be very elaborate and you want to redo an entire prompt. Whatever it may be, those prompts living outside of our repository and being handled completely separate from the code itself allows us to make deployments on Vellum completely separated from deployments in our code base, so on our actual servers. So it allows us to say, okay, we're getting some reports that X and Y is giving us interesting answers. We can look in the logs. We can trace directly to the execution on Vellum, execution being the actual moment we called Vellum with these variables in place and got a response. We can see everything that happened in every single node that we built in Vellum. So we find the line, or not the line, the node that, or the prompt that failed. It wasn't that it failed, it just gave us a response that we weren't in love with. And so we can make those updates and click a button, deploy that update immediately. And it's 100% just at that moment. Anything that goes into that workflow now is using the new deployed prompt. So talk about speed. We don't even consider it a deployment anymore. It's just so quickly iterative that we can constantly make it better and better without actually having to say, hey, we're doing a deploy, let's make sure everyone's on board. We just have the right stakeholders using Vellum or using our development environment, which we can speak of how I've split up our environments, that can be using a specific tag that we've put in Vellum. So if we want to just test it in Vellum, I feel confident just testing it in Vellum is actually sufficient. But if it's a little more intricate and we want to make sure it integrated perfectly into the broader system, because it is a little distributed, then we can put it on the development environment and then just deploy it without ever having to do a real production deploy of our servers.
That's cool. I guess and we have a question here from Adriana. Do you save the returns that are not good enough to analyze, like creating a database with both successful and failed results?
They are all saved in Vellum. We don't save anything on our end. We used to before we implemented Vellum. We basically tried to implement Vellum, or we tried to build a Vellum for all of this, which is a nightmare. I don't recommend it. And so Vellum saves everything, both positive and negative. They also save errors. So if something were to have actually gone wrong and it didn't make a return, it'll save that as well. And so you can diagnose it right there in Vellum.
I guess to abstract it away from Vellum, there's a lot of folks here that, aren't currently Vellum customers and might never be, and that's totally chill. But I think the key takeaways so far is whether you use tooling for this, you use an external vendor, or you build it in-house, some of the important takeaways are you should be capturing this monitoring data, right? You should know the inputs and outputs at each step in this pipeline, and especially your LLM invocations somewhere. You should be able to make that accessible to the people that are doing your prompt engineering and prompt experimentation so that they can find those error cases in the logs and easily iterate on the prompt to pass those error cases. And then finally, it sounds like being able to push changes to your live prompts and maybe even your live pipelines, decoupled from the rest of your like larger application deploy cycle, is only good in that it accelerates like your iteration speeds.
Correct. It's a little silly to have to wait on a full production deploy to add a sentence to a prompt to help it with one little thing. So, yeah, totally agree.
Now, you mentioned that you have these different environments, like a staging environment. We can talk about like what this looks like in Vellum, but also more like conceptually, like what is the problem statement that you were trying to solve by having these different environments, and what does it look like to have like a production versus staging environment for your AI systems?
Yeah, we call it development and production. My team's not, I think they wanted to be staging again, and I think it's just development, so we call it development. Anyway, I mean, this is just a straight software engineering, not an AI like question. It's just how do you differentiate between your like environments? It doesn't matter if it's AI or not. Like you need to have an environment that replicates your production environment in general. If you don't, you can never actually apples to apples diagnose any issues or see any bugs that you might be deploying to production. And so with like AI applications, it's very rare now that the deployments that we do on the servers are very AI intensive, meaning most of it is put into a black box API call. When I say black box, I mean it's just an API call. We're not like, we don't care we expect it to give us a response, but that's like totally separated from the code, our code itself.
Kind of like a microservice, right? Like it is a
microservice, 100%. Yeah, it is absolutely a microservice. And within the microservice, there's more microservices. But so for us, it's very rare that we actually have like a deployment that changes the AI. We put everything in Vellum. So unless we're adding a new workflow or we drastically need to change what the requests are taking in, so potentially they have different variables.
That microservice, right?
Exactly. There's a handshake that we've created, and it's completely separated, and that's helped us a lot with allowing us to deploy a little bit easier, because there's a lot of complexities already with just deployments in general. Adding in this layer of AI complexity is a headache I'd rather not deal with.
So to bring it back to the PDF example, it sounds like you've created this Vellum workflow that has some handshake with your web servers, where the web server provides the PDF or maybe a link to the PDF. That's the input to this black box. The Vellum workflow, through a series of operations and LLM calls, does all of its processing and eventually responds with a JSON response. And then that's what a JSON response consisting of the extracted and structured data. And then that's what your web server then consumes and uses downstream.
Exactly. Put it simply, exactly. Seems so simple.
It does. If only it were all that simple. But I think the magic goes into like what happens in that black box and how can you get it to consistently return good responses given that input.
Yeah. And so I will say, so we had this operation prior to implementing it into like into a workflow. And again, I'll be Vellum. I won't say like specifically for Vellum, because there are other platforms that allow you to do like, node to node operations, meaning like you basically are creating a diagram of logic. In my head, that's now how I think of a lot of like almost everything. So prior to us putting it into a diagram of logic, it was in code. So everything that Noah just said about what we do for this one specific AI operation, we did it in code prior. So it's possible to do it just completely in code in our current repository, but there's so many issues with that. It worked, right? Like we had it working, but it doesn't scale well. And it is really hard to maintain, really hard to address where things go wrong. The new paradigm of actually shifting and taking all of that to an actual like visual workflow has been a game changer. And there's so many benefits, like onboarding new engineers. It's just visually like, this is what's going on. You can just see it perfectly. You don't have to go dissect the code and like try to follow different methods and things. It's just, here you go. There's no if else statements that you have to like jump around code bases. It's all in one place.
Yeah, our take with this is like these visual diagrams or like these graph builders are really, really useful for troubleshooting and debugging when things go wrong. Like you can see exactly where things start to fall out and what like inputs were given in order to generate that problematic response. They're especially helpful when there's a lot of like asynchronous and concurrent or parallel operations where, you know, in code, it's like pretty straightforward to read code if it's like from top to bottom, right? But if you've got like async operations, like, you know, think about like JavaScript, like promise.all and promise.any, and like just being able to like reason about and visualize mentally what's happening gets pretty complicated pretty quick. But that's where AI is like, you know, in software engineering, that might be like slightly less common. Obviously, there's still a lot of parallel execution and looping and stuff, but in AI, it's like everywhere, especially if you're building like agentic operations that are looping around and checking its own work and things like that. And so being able to visualize these like naturally complex, parallel, asynchronous looping interactions, having a visual graph to see that can be huge.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this might be a funny conversation like 2 or 3 years down the road, but the fact that we have to overcome the latency of these LLMs, like there is no such application where you have to wait 3 seconds to get a response, right? But now that AI is out, it's the actual response is just so astronomically better that we are now willing to wait for it and like work around it. And so because of that latency, you do have to build a lot. Like you have to keep that latency in mind and build a lot of these asynchronous workflows. So how can we have multiple things running in parallel so that we can get a response in 4 seconds instead of 16 seconds, right? These are all like very important things. Yeah, but I'm very curious to see if it's still a problem in a couple of years.
Totally. We actually just got a really relevant question here. How about the timing of the response? And like, what can you share about your experience in waiting for interactions and giving the response back?
Yeah, I mean, this is a product question, and we have solved it in a lot of different ways. You think about how ChatGPT works, right? You ask it a question, and if it's a long answer, it's streaming the response. Even if you really need to have all of it at once, like let's say it's like you just want to wait for it to finish and then you'll read it, you know it's working, it's doing something that's a lot more like, I'm willing to wait for it. It looks like it's doing something, I like it, I just mentally feel better about it. If you just had it spinning for 10 seconds, the experience would be pretty shitty, right? Like a lot of people would just leave. So we've taken that to heart and added a lot of features, a lot of like, I mean, it is essentially a loading mechanism, but being able to present as much information as possible earlier while it's making its decisions and doing its things. So whether you're streaming like the actual Vellum request, and again, not just Vellum, but if you're making multiple requests in code and there's like a workflow you've built out in your own code base, and it's like, okay, it's finished, you know, step 1, now it's on step 2. Each of these take 2 seconds. So by the end, you're at 10 seconds or so. That's a hell of a long time to wait in 2024. And so you need to show them something. You need to like figure out your product in a sense that it captivates them to stay and it makes them feel like it's actually doing something. I know, like, I've been on some apps a couple of years ago, pre-AI, where it took like 10 seconds to load something, but I actually think it was ready in second number 1, but they wanted to make it look like it was doing a lot more stuff. So they had this like crazy loading experience, and it actually captivated me. I was like, oh, it's doing so much. It's like figuring this out, it's figuring that out. But then I actually looked at the network request and was like, oh, it actually, I checked it again. I was like, oh, it
That's
actually
funny.
finished up in 1 second, but
Yeah.
smart.
I really like what you said, that it's like ultimately a product problem, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I think a lot of this comes down to not like literal latency, but perceived latency. Like, what does your end customer perceive the latency to be? And so the more you can do with like showing incremental results, either whether that's like streaming the LLM output as it becomes available, or for these multi-step pipelines, like trying to show progress or show intermediate results, you can get away with a lot of latency if you have a great perceived latency. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I will also, and kind of going down a path, an unscripted path, but that's kind of my style. As we're thinking about this, thinking about how and what you're building as a product, I think is super important in today's world. We built products a year ago that didn't work because the AI was A, not good enough, and B, not fast enough. Oh, and probably because not cost effective. But the first two are the most important in that regard. And we knew that at some point we would just wake up and OpenAI would be like, we solved it for you. And that's exactly what happened multiple times for us. So we build product thinking ahead on what AI can do as opposed to what it can do now. So the idea of like the perceived latency or like being able to captivate them enough so they stay is a band-aid to what you can do later down the road. So if your product does take 20 seconds, build it. And if the value is there and you can captivate them enough, then that's awesome. In a year, they won't have to wait anymore. And again,
Yeah.
I don't know that for a fact, but I would bet money on it that it'll come down substantially in time and cost and up in quality. So I'm all in on that bet, and that's everything that we do here at Wellflow. We bet on that.
I think like that's very consistent with advice that we typically give, which is, especially if you're starting out with these projects that use AI, our general advice is like, A, like validate that they solve a real problem for your customer above all else. And B, like in doing so, like prove that you can get it to work. Like forget cost, forget latency, just like validate that you can get the thing to do the thing. And if you can, then typically the next step is to like set up evals to confirm that it can consistently do that thing, even if you make a change. And then from there, you optimize, right? Like, and again, bringing it back to software development, you hear this term of like premature optimization frequently. And I think it's applied, people do a lot of premature optimization for AI as well. They worry about the cost or the latency early rather than trying to get it to work and prove that it solves a real problem. But if you can get it to work, solve a real problem, set up your evals, then it makes it really, really easy to maybe change your architecture of your pipeline or swap out to a newer, faster, cheaper model as they come out. And then use your evals to ensure that you're not going to regress in behavior.
I couldn't agree more. Everyone in my company knows, or everyone on my team at least, is cost is absolutely secondary when it comes to innovation on AI. I don't care if it costs $100 for one request, for like one thing to happen. We're not going to put it on production most likely, but if you can get it to do what we want, then we'll pay the $100 for a few iterations. And exactly what you said, Noah. Set up your evals. What can we do to reduce this cost? And also start showing customers, because if it's super impressive, even if it's not cost effective, you're the first one to show it. That's very valuable. And so at that point, you get some feedback that, hey, this is actually impressive to customers. Let's go all in on it. And depending on, every company's got their own priorities and their own funding and whatever. But sometimes it's worth it just to lose money on these things to get it out the door, get people using it. Obviously, if you have thousands of people clicking a button that costs you $100 each time, you better have raised a bunch of money. But it might actually work.
Yeah. Yeah, the way we like to, we approach product development similarly, which is like the bigger the bet, the more the due diligence, right? Like if it's a small bet, don't bother doing much due diligence, just ship it and see what people think. But if it's going to take a lot of resources, whether it's engineering time or LLM costs, like you do a little more testing and maybe talking to customers ahead of time. Let's see. So we mentioned like when new models come out, like we run these regression tests. I guess like, can you tell us more, Jordan, about your iteration process? That could be like iterating based on these like problems that you see in the wild, or maybe it's like, hey, OpenAI just dropped O1 and you want to see if it performs better. Like, what are the things that might cause you, I guess like taking a step back, one, what are the things that might cause you to want to make a change? And two, how do you go about making that change? And then finally, three, how do you gain the confidence to deploy that change knowing that it won't break stuff?
Yeah. Okay. First off, does OpenAI release a new model? Yeah, you make a change. You just change everything over to the new model. That's the way it goes. It's going to be cheaper and better, most likely. I guess O1 preview is not production ready yet, or tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we're there with like I guess quota. I think our quota is pretty low for that. But anyway, that's a no-brainer. But I think more importantly, what you're getting at is how do we iterate, or how do we go in and actually make these changes? How do we feel confident about them? So one thing that I always wanted to do when we were just writing the prompts in our own code base and hitting it OpenAI directly is I want to get people not on our engineering team, not even in the technical team, to be more involved on prompting. They're the ones that are actually in the field getting reports from customers, seeing the output a lot more than the engineers are. And so that was my dream all along. And now we do it. We don't do it for everything. There's still some pretty complicated prompts that don't make a ton of sense unless you were the one to write them. But for a lot of our processes, a lot of our prompting, we have our sales and ops teams actually in there looking at it and capable of making adjustments. Once they make the adjustment, they see the results are better than what they were before. We have test cases on all of our prompting. We can run them and see how they do. Then I feel confident nearly immediately to deploy for those types of situations. There's obviously other situations where they could cause like cascading effects that sales and ops don't really understand. So they go through us anyway. But the amount of time that you take on prompt engineering is pretty unbelievable. Like I could just sit down at 9 a.m. on like a silly prompt, and then all of a sudden it's lunchtime. And I'm like, where did that 3 hours go? I think the prompt's better. Like you can go in circles. It's kind of fun. But you can go in circles, but it's good for other people to start understanding how do these prompts actually affect the results. It's not an engineer's responsibility. It really can be anyone in the company. So opening up that opportunity for other people to be involved in how you're doing the prompt engineering, I think what Vellum does very well, or a lot of these other systems that are specifically there to store and basically assess the results of the prompts, is being able to sandbox, being able to go side by side with different models, side by side with different prompts, and seeing what the outputs result in, and having people outside of the engineering team do it. In terms of me feeling confident with it, I just need to see the results, right? If you run 10, if we were getting 8 out of 10 responses correct prior, and now we're getting 10 out of 10, I don't think I need much more proof to just deploy it. Seems pretty sound. We do have a process in place to make sure that works. A lot of the results aren't static, right? You're not just looking for a true false. You do have to say, like, is this correct? And as my weird example before of like the pimento cheeseburger, like sometimes you can understand why the model decided that it was spicy. Like it kind of just had it inferred something that does actually make sense. And if you go to a human, there's a chance that they will do the same thing. So like it's very hard to say why this was right or wrong in some situations, but you want it to always trend in the positive direction, I'd say.
You said something really interesting there, Jordan, which is engineering doesn't own the prompts. Like, I think I anticipate there's like polarizing reactions to that in the crowd. Like, some people are like, "Oh my god, they don't own the prompts," and then others are probably like, "Oh, thank God they don't own the prompts." Um, you know, I I have my own biases here, but I would love to hear more about like why is that the case, and where is the ownership divide? Like, what is engineering owning in this world?
Yeah, I hope it's polarizing because I stand by it, but I'd say it's experimental. Um, and I think like the actual action of creating a prompt and understanding what that prompt is supposed to output is the responsibility of the engineers. I'll start with that, because at that point they need to, it's an integrated system, right, into the broader servers. So it does need to have the round trip that only really the engineers are going to be like understanding of how that
So the
works, because they
engineer's
own the
like,
whole stack.
I need a microservice where I pass this and get this.
Yep,
Basically.
exactly. I need a microservice to tell, is this a hot dog? Yes or no, right? And at that point, you've created that microservice in Vellum or wherever, and it just, the only thing it does is look at a picture and say hot dog, not hot dog. Great, got that. Now I'm getting some results that people are writing in and saying, this is actually a dog dressed up as a hot dog, and it's saying yes. And that's a problem. And so the team that's getting these tickets is not engineering directly, right?
Mm.
And so the problem is somebody outside of engineering has a lot more context on why things are going right or wrong, right? They can compile maybe a few examples, but if in their head they're like, oh, we need to make sure that if it's something wearing a hot dog costume, it's not a hot dog. And so they can mess around and use that image as one of the test cases and make that prompt better without ever having an engineer involved. Like, that's just easy. It's easy to do for those types of situations. So I do stand by that. I think engineering doesn't need to own the prompts. I think engineering needs to set up the prompts today, and then people outside of the tech org should be involved. And I think more and more non-tech staff will be involved more and more in the AI projects, because it is a lot less code. It's more just English writing. Um, like, we encourage everyone at Wellflow to use as much AI in their day-to-day life, in day-to-day job and life, and they should be, anytime they're going to ask a question, just ask ChatGPT first. 99% of the time, it's pretty good.
I mean, the cool thing about this to me is like, not only is it like more efficient, right? Like, your engineers are freed up to do more engineering, but it's also like, it sounds like they're truly the right people to be doing this task, right? Like, they have the most context. They're seeing these customer support tickets. They're seeing the patterns and like, able to apply their human thought processes and thinking about what tweaks might make sense to that prompt. Whereas if I'm a engineer on the engineering team and I get a Jira ticket come my way saying, hey, this is actually a dog wearing a hot dog, it probably is going to be like sound like a chore to me to go in and like mess around with this prompt until it's working.
Totally. I would also say engineers are more comfortable with prompts, and like, there's a lot of everyone's got their own flavor on how they do it, right? It's because they're the only ones that are doing it. So I think there's a lot of hesitation to switch over to non-technical staff, because they need some guidance on how to actually begin making these prompts. And so you got to pull a trigger and try it. We put our money where our mouth is. Like, we encourage everyone to do it. We want people in there. We're going to be ramping that concept up a lot this next year.
That's cool. I can say that, like, we as a vendor in this space are very bullish on this idea and believe that it's, our role to provide the tooling needed such that you feel comfortable leveraging non-technical teams as part of this process, right? Like, providing things like evals such that a non-technical person can can run like, or maybe even have an engineer set up the evals so that the engineer can be like, hey, non-technical person, as long as your prompt can pass this test suite, like
Yep,
I'm good with it. Ship whatever you want, you know?
totally. And isn't that what you do when you set up test suites in your regular like application, right?
Yeah,
So
if
have a
you're
new
doing like
engineer
test
come
driven
in.
development, totally.
Exactly. Feel confident about somebody coming in and making any modifications as long as everything is green at the end, right?
Yep.
Or there's more green than there was before. So that's yeah, that's totally how I see it.
Yeah, very cool. Let's see, we're getting towards the end here, so I'm going to start tapping into some of these questions. And if you're out there
Sure.
listening, please feel free to send in more questions, especially as it relates to like getting stuff into production and iterating once there.
Yeah, I was
We've got,
actually going to say, actually, in the very beginning, you encourage people to share what they're working on
yeah,
as well. So, like, one thing that has changed for me since AI and also since the concept of just making these workflows visual as opposed to in code is I have like a zillion side projects that are not really side projects. Like, they help me do stuff. And there's been a few that I've been wanting to build for a while, and I'll just take like it took like 2 hours the other weekend and built this thing that was like literally solved my problems. And I did it all in Vellum in like 2 hours
that's wild.
using like Twilio, Google Maps, uh, obviously OpenAI, just like all this stuff. Like I'd love to hear like what other people are like, experimenting. And I honestly just encourage you to just build like if something comes to mind, just wake up early one day and just do it. It's so
Yep.
fun.
Yeah, this was a common thing in our first session in our webinar series, which is like, you know, what's the best way to prototype an idea or pitch it internally? And I think the resounding answer is just go build it.
Yeah.
Like find something that excites you enough where you want to do it at night or on the weekend and go build it and prove the value from there. Um, let's see. So we've got one. What's the side project that involves maps, Jordan? Do you feel comfortable sharing?
Oh yeah, I can share it. It's funny. I actually I've been talking about it for like 2 years, and I was like, I should just build it. It's probably really easy. Basically, all my I find all my restaurants that I want to go to on Instagram, and I just save them. Me and my wife just save like we have a folder, so we just have like just shared places. But I want them mapped. So if I'm out, I want to see what's around me. I don't want to have to go through them.
Mm-hmm.
So then I started putting them in Google Maps, and I was like, well, cool. Now they're in Google Maps, but they don't connect to the LinkedIn post. So now I just share it to a Twilio number that I bought. It'll pull out the data and map it with the video in the little like pin. So I can see where I am, click the pin, boom, done.
Nice.
I'm taking investments, seed round.
You heard it here first. We've got a question here. It sounds like Vellum helps to decide which model to use for a given application. Based on your personal experience, do you think that you end up getting closer to one model and end up exploring only that one? And it's like you know how to speak to that specific model.
That is a really good question. I have an example and give to this. So we oftentimes do an assessment on all possible models if OpenAI does not give us what we want, because it tends to be for us the best. We are not, again, we're not building stories. So it's not about how creative it is. We are doing actual workflows that augment humans. So it's all about the logic. And so it has to be really intelligent, not creative. And so it tends to work the best. I will say we do put it side by side in a prompt comparison with all of the other models. And we test them. We test them every time. And for the first time, OpenAI actually was the worst. And so here's like a really random example, but it's interesting because it shows you different companies, different models, open source models, or sorry, open or closed source models are trained on just clearly different data. And so we do like all sorts of casing and like grammar and crazy stuff for all different languages. But OpenAI was really bad at casing German, and Llama 3 was not. Llama 3 just like some reason was really good at casing like title casing, sentence casing for the German language, like far above everyone else, which is just so random. I mean,
Yeah, how
like,
specific.
so like those are the things that are good to test because it really depends on what kind of data have they, what is their training data. A lot of them will be very similar, and then you can just use your judgment on cost and quality and speed. But usually we go with OpenAI. We love them. I think they're like truly a pretty remarkable company with a remarkable product.
Cool. We have another question here, which is, have you deployed multi-AI agent applications on production? And if yes, what was it like and which framework? And if not yet, then why? And I think, Ahmed, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but I think you mean like, multiple prompts in the same system, potentially using different models under the hood.
If that's the case, then absolutely. Almost all of our workflows or all of our processes require more than one prompt within the space. So to go back to that example of casing in German, we don't just have one endpoint that helps us case German. That's like a very small node in a much larger node. So you can think about the original example I gave about dissecting a PDF. So we have categories, items, whatever. We need to case each individual part of that menu. Casing meaning like we need to turn this into a title case or turn this into a sentence case. And so within the actual like workflow itself, there are that Llama node is actually the Llama 3 node is actually running asynchronously with all of the other items. So it shoots off 100 requests, all happening at once. But that only happened after it ran, some other nodes, being like OpenAI's like 4.0 vision model. Mm-hmm. So it is downstream of some other models, and then even after that, it runs more. So I think maybe like I've actually asked a few friends of mine, like, why are you not using like a workflow? Like, why are you not using like a visual workflow to do these things? And it makes sense. A lot of the applications are very simple. There's still a huge amount of benefit to wiring it up to something like Vellum, so you can from the beginning trace and see exactly like when and why things aren't working. But you'll know what I'm talking about once you get to scale and you have a lot of things happening all in one workflow, and it makes things just astronomically easier to maintain.
Jordan, clarify point on this one. Do you use any like tool calling, or like where the LLM is like using tool calls and then you're maybe like invoking a code node or API node with those arguments generated by the LLM?
A tool node meaning like a third-party tool,
or rather like LLMs with function calling.
Function calling. So we used to use function calling prior to structured outputs. Again, everyone has their own flavor of prompting. Everyone has their own flavor of how they want to write their workflows. Function calling is like in a lot of the tutorials I watch and view, like function calling is the primary, like the preferred use case. We just now use a lot of structured outputs and then use those structured outputs to create logic after that. So I'd say no for me, but that does not mean that you shouldn't use them. I think most people are still using function calling.
Yeah, structured output's really, really useful if all you're trying to do is like extract, structured data from your LLM response. Function calling definitely still has a place if you're using AI to decide what inputs to pass to an action that performs a side effect, right? Now, I will say, and to answer the question of like which framework, it sounds like, Jordan, you're just using Vellum workflows for all of this. And I will note that like function calling is natively supported in Vellum workflows. You can define them in your prompts. You can extract it from the prompt node and then pass it to like an API node or code execution node for those interested.
Yeah. And just like coding in general, like you can do the same thing 100 ways. So you can figure out how to accomplish the same thing with or without function calling. There are probably instances where it's probably better for us to use function calling, but our flavor is that we don't do it at the moment.
Yeah, totally fair.
Yeah.
Awesome, everyone. Well, we are at time. So I would just like to thank everyone so much for joining. And of course, thank Jordan here for joining me. Just to recap, we've talked about decoupling AI updates from your application layer, making sure that you have tooling to monitor what's happening once you're in production, splitting responsibilities between technical and non-technical team members, and iterating quickly. So that is it from us, but please feel free to reach out to either of us at any time. Here are some QR codes to our LinkedIns. And yeah, especially if you've joined us for the prior 2 sessions, thanks for your participation, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.